The ruthless millionaire humiliated the waitress, dragging her into a deserted hallway, leaving the crowd stunned. But when a child's voice pierced the silence, "Don't touch her," the entire room of power instantly froze. No one expected that this very moment would force the man who thought he held all the cards to bow before the truth. Do you believe that sometimes a small truth is stronger than all the money and fame in the world? Leave a comment saying, "I choose the truth," to begin the story. The glass plate crashed onto the marble floor, shattering into pieces. The sound echoed sharply amid the smooth jazz and the sophisticated laughter of people in tailored suits. All eyes immediately turned toward the center of the room. There, Lena, the shift manager of the Ward Group restaurant, stood trembling, holding an order slip. Facing her was Ethan Ward, the CEO of the corporation. His face was rigid, as if his composure had finally cracked. "What did you just do?" His voice was low, not loud, but so heavy that those nearby held their breath. No one understood what had happened. This evening was meticulously prepared to be perfect. A private party hosting the Hartley Group, a multi-million-dollar strategic contract, a deal that would determine the fate of Ward Group. Ethan, a man who always demanded absolute control, was personally present to oversee every detail. Yet, right in the midst of that solemn atmosphere, Lena had approached him with a tense expression. She had just discovered that the opening soup intended for Mr. Hartley contained the wrong ingredient, a sauce he absolutely had to avoid due to a heart condition. Lena knew the unwritten rule: keep silent, deal with it later. But for her, honesty couldn't wait. She chose to speak up, even knowing the price would be her career. Ethan heard the explanation and saw only a catastrophe. He looked around, seeing his partner Hartley watching, seeing his staff frozen, seeing the light reflecting off the shattered floor, and he heard his own heart pounding rapidly. Only one thought filled his mind. He was losing control in front of a client. A laugh erupted at a nearby table. The faint sound of clinking glasses. Every small sound felt like a slap to his prestige. The fear of losing his standing, the very thing he'd spent his life building, rose stronger than reason. Ethan snatched the slip from her hand. He didn't bother reading it. He only saw a woman who dared to interrupt the party over a little seasoning. Rage flooded him. An instinctual self-defense for a man who always needed total authority. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Lena?" His voice was low, even, but cold as metal. "You caused this disruption just over a minor detail. Don't you understand business priorities? I hired you to keep things running smoothly, not to be a moral hero." He took another step forward. His gaze swept the hall, where a few guests were curiously glancing over. The public shame hit him like a scorching flame. In a moment of blind fury, he grabbed Lena's wrist, squeezing hard, not to inflict pain, but to force her out of Mr. Hartley's sight. He dragged her away, his voice husky. "Do you think you deserve this position? Someone who doesn't know when to keep silent? You are nothing but a shift manager. Don't forget that." Lena froze, hurt not by the force of the pull, but by the humiliation of being treated like she was beneath contempt. She tried to speak, her voice choked but clear. "Mr. Ward, I only wanted to protect the client's health." "Honesty?" he sneered. "That's idiotic naivete. Here, the result is the only morality." He hadn't taken another step when a young voice rang out, clear and trembling. "Don't touch her." The sound cut through the thick air. Everyone turned. At the end of the hallway stood a girl about 6 years old, her hair tied unevenly, her two hands clutching her backpack straps. Her eyes were large and bright, reflecting a mix of fear and innocent indignation. Mia, Lena's daughter. She had arrived early to pick up her mother and had unintentionally witnessed everything. Ethan froze. His grip loosened on Lena's wrist. The room plunged into silence. Mr. Hartley set down his napkin, watching, saying nothing. Every gaze was fixed on them. In that split second, Ethan didn't see Lena or the child. He saw the image of his lost daughter reflected in the little girl's eyes. That gaze, both innocent and painful, cut through the layers of arrogance he had built for years like a knife through thin cloth. He remembered the last time his daughter cried, and he was too busy looking at his phone screen to look up. The old, burning shame flooded him, choking him. He released her hand, stepping back half a pace. The jazz music still played, but to him, everything seemed distant. He tried to find words, but no words were sufficient. Every term in his vocabulary of power suddenly felt useless. He only looked at Lena, her face pale but her back still straight, then looked at the child still watching him, her eyes glistening. Not with hatred, just disappointment. It was a feeling he had never known. Losing to himself, Ethan turned away, striding quickly toward the private elevator. Each step felt like a blow against the conscience that had just awakened. Behind him, Lena stood motionless. She didn't cry. She bent down and picked up the fallen order slip, her hand shaking slightly from both the cold and the shame. Mia ran to her, wrapping her arms around her mother, her small face pressed against her. Lena stroked her daughter's hair, whispering, "It's okay, honey. Mom's fine." But her voice was hoarse, as if she couldn't even believe it herself. In the middle of the splendid hall, the mother and daughter quietly left. Behind them, the marble floor was still stained with soup, and the lights reflected off the glass fragments like unhealed cuts. Ethan stepped into the elevator, his finger trembling slightly as he pushed the button. The door closed. In the brief moment before the steel frame slid shut, he saw the child's eyes again, the gaze that forced a man who thought he was powerful to bow down. For the first time in years, Ethan Ward did not feel victorious. He only felt that he had humiliated the most righteous thing in that room. That night, the rain fell slowly. As if to prolong the lingering effects of the ended party, the last guests left the restaurant amidst hushed goodbyes. The yellow light from the lobby reflected onto the wet street, spreading soft streaks of light, like memories yet to be closed. Lena wrapped a thin shawl around her daughter's shoulders. Mia had fallen asleep, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Lena walked slowly, her water-soaked shoes making small, regular sounds. No one walked them out. No one said anything. In the distance, Ethan Ward's black car pulled out of the parking lot. From the back seat, he looked through the window, seeing the figures of the mother and daughter walking in the rain. A heavy feeling in his chest made him clench his jaw slightly. Then he told himself, "She made me look bad," a familiar phrase half to quell his guilt, half to cling to the belief that he was right. The next morning, rumors spread throughout the Ward group. People spoke of the overstepping shift manager, the screaming child during the VIP party, and the CEO losing his temper in front of a partner. The story traveled through every hallway, embellished by every teller. But in every version, Lena was always the cause of Ethan's loss of face. In his office on the 40th floor, Ethan read the media report. The phrase, "severe disruption caused," stood out on the screen. He folded it and threw it onto the desk. "I don't care who she is," he said dryly. "Just make this stop." Immediately, across from him, Victor Lang, the restaurant's COO, gently replied, "Absolutely. Mr. Ward, I'll handle it smoothly." His voice was calm and calculating. Ethan nodded, without suspicion. He was accustomed to trusting Victor as he trusted himself. In the world he built, suspicion was always seen as weakness. Victor was the man he chose because he never made him lose control, or at least, that's what he thought. When the door closed, Victor walked slowly toward his office, a faint smile playing on his lips. Ethan was angry, and anger always needed a place to vent. Victor knew well that with clever redirection, that place to vent would land squarely on Lena. That same afternoon, Victor walked into the shift manager's office, holding a folder of documents. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "I reviewed yesterday's order slip. The system records your account as the final confirmer." Lena froze. "That's impossible. I corrected the error before service." Victor merely shrugged. "Perhaps someone used your account." "But, Mr. Ward needs someone to take responsibility." One sentence was enough for her to understand everything. "You know I didn't make the mistake," Lena replied, her voice low but firm. "Sometimes." Victor smiled. "Silence is the only way to keep a job." He left, leaving a thick, heavy void behind him. Lena sat down, her hand still resting on the folder. She understood that silence protected no one when people chose to live in the shadow of deceit. At the end of the day, Ethan received the internal investigation file. He skimmed a few lines: code, number, signature, access log. At the bottom of the page, the name Lena Dawson was printed in bold. He paused, then closed the file. "Complete the termination procedure." His assistant looked up, slightly hesitant. "Don't you want to hear her explanation?" "No," Ethan replied curtly. "I don't have time for people who lack professionalism." The statement sounded tough, but it was actually a shield covering his fear, the fear that if he listened to her, he would have to admit he was wrong. The day Lena left, it rained again. She didn't tell anyone. She packed her belongings in a small bag, draped a shawl over Mia, and walked out the restaurant's back door. No one stopped them, and no one saw them off. Only Victor stood far down the hallway, watching with a triumphant smile. When she reached the street, Lena paused in front of the brightly lit sign. Ward Group Fine Dining. 3 years of work. Countless late nights. So many times covering shifts for others, now compressed into one look. She bent down, pulling the hood over her daughter's head. Her hand trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the feeling of letting go of something she had poured her heart into keeping. "Go to sleep, honey," she whispered. "I'm sorry, but I don't regret it." The mother and daughter disappeared into the rain, small but straight figures. In the basement, Ethan sat in his private car. He hadn't left yet. As he adjusted the rearview mirror, he saw the mother and daughter crossing the intersection. The rain slanted, blurring their shapes through the glass. Mia turned her head just for a second. Her little eyes met his gaze. No anger, nor fear, just disappointment. A gaze, so quiet it made his heart clench. Ethan lowered the mirror, turning away. His hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if to choke the feeling that had just surged. He whispered, "She chose the wrong way." But the deepest part of him knew he was the one who was wrong. That night, he stood by the window of his high-rise apartment, watching the rain streak down the glass. In his glass of wine, the image of the little girl and her short sentence echoed again, "Don't touch her." He closed his eyes. The sound of the rain blended with his heartbeat, steady and empty. Ethan didn't know that while he was trying to suppress that feeling, another mistake had quietly begun. A mistake that wouldn't just cost him an employee. It was about to swallow the entire empire he had built on confidence and arrogance. A month later, every time he raised his glass of wine, the little girl's eyes appeared through the glass. Those clear eyes distracted him so much that tonight, before the wine touched his lips, he set it down. The phone vibrated. Financial reports arrived. The flagship restaurant's revenue dropped 18%, and ingredient costs rose unusually. A small note reading, "Need to re-examine supplier invoices," made him uneasy. Ethan opened his laptop. Numbers stretched across the screen. The numbers lay still like a river. But the longer he looked, the more he saw the current flowing backward. Revenue plummeted. Costs ballooned. And a series of payments were logged at the wrong time. There were even invoices with matching codes but different dates, which had never happened before. He leaned back slowly in his chair, a heavy feeling in his heart, as if something was slipping from his grasp. Previously, everything was meticulously checked, not a single detail wrong. But the person who used to do that had left in the rain. He called the security department. "Show me the night camera footage in the manager's office and at the cashier's counter, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. At 1 in the morning. The monitoring room was lit only by the screen reflecting on his face. The black and white images gradually appeared. 23, 18. Victor Lang entered the room, turned on the desk lamp, plugged in a USB, then quickly signed a stack of papers with his head down. 0.05 分. He moved to the cashier's machine, typing skillfully, opening the Order Adjustment menu. Ethan stared at the reflection on the framed wall photo, not perfectly clear, but enough to see the Create Temporary Supplier Invoice screen light up. Each click was like a hammer blow against the trust he had placed in Victor. He asked them to rewind another segment, the day Lena left. The screen showed the hallway behind the kitchen. Victor stood blocking the way, holding a folder. "You confirmed this order, correct?" His voice was clear through the speaker. Lena stood still. "I did not confirm it. I warned about the ingredient allergy." Victor smiled faintly. "But the system log has your name." She did not reply. Her gaze was calm, like a lake surface with no ripples. She knew exactly what he was doing, but chose to leave in silence, allowing the truth to speak for itself. Ethan paused the video. In the cold room, the sound of the fan was like his own heartbeat. He whispered, "She saw everything, and still chose to remain silent, just so the truth could remain whole." He closed his eyes, realizing a simple, painful truth. He had humiliated the only person who dared to tell him the truth. Ethan opened his notebook, starting to write something he rarely did anymore. Examine the supplier list. Retrieve system login times. Review data from the USB Victor plugged in that night. Check. Cancel divided by adjust permissions after hours. Verify who used to reconcile the ledger. Lena. He stopped writing at the last line, underlining it twice. A voice echoed inside him. No one else in this company ever dared to tell you the truth like she did. And now, only the truth can save you. The phone rang. A text message from Victor. "Branch meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. I've prepared a presentation to reassure the Hartley clients. We should agree that the issue originated from the former shift manager's mistake. A month ago, he would have agreed instantly, but tonight, he merely took a screenshot of the message and saved it in the evidence folder. He called the IT department, temporarily lock Victor's data access. No announcement. Reason, maintenance." The technician's voice trembled slightly. "Yes. See." When he stepped outside, it was nearly dawn. The hallway was empty. Only the sound of the extractor fan and the smell of overnight coffee. Ethan stopped at the glass door, looking down at the wet street. He remembered the image of Lena carrying her daughter across the intersection, small but proud figures, and he, sitting in his car, didn't dare open the door. The elevator ascended slowly. On every lit floor, he recalled the years he lived, believing that control was strength. Now he understood that true strength was daring to look at his own mistakes. Back in his office, he brewed a pot of warm water instead of wine. 3 windows were open on the screen, simultaneously. Revenue, supplier, system permissions. A new message from the IT department appeared. Log for the past week downloaded. Detected multiple late-night access sessions from Victor's account and 2 subordinates. File attached. He read it, then gave a faint, sad smile. The traces were obvious, like interwoven threads. Same IP, same time, same operations. In one corner, there was even a login using Lena's account, but from Victor's machine, he knew he had found the key. Ethan picked up the phone, his voice deep but decisive. Get Melina Dawson's address. I need to meet her. As soon as possible. The assistant hesitated. Do you want to inform Victor about the audit? Ethan looked out the window at the rising sun. No, not yet. He hung up, taking a deep breath. The morning light shone onto his desk, illuminating the last line he had just added to his notebook. Make amends, starting with the person I wronged. He stood up, tucking the notebook into his jacket pocket. The old phrase still echoed in his mind, the child's voice, clear and firm. Don't touch her. This time, it wasn't a warning, but a reminder of what was right. Ethan walked out into the hallway, the first light of day reflecting on the glass. Somewhere in the city, the woman he had driven away still held the only piece that could save the Ward Group empire, and perhaps the remaining good part of himself. After the night of reviewing the camera footage, Ethan closed his notebook, grabbed his keys, and went straight to the garage. The black car drove out of the basement, glided through the downtown strip, and then turned into the outskirts. Along both sides of the road were old brick buildings, tangled wires, and peeling patches of paint. He had Lena's address. He hadn't called ahead. Not to surprise her. Just because he didn't know what to say over the phone, Lena left home earlier than usual. She wore a thin jacket, carrying a small bag of tools and worn rubber gloves. In the morning, she cleaned a small office on the 3rd floor with no elevator. At noon, she washed glasses for a self-service cafe. In the afternoon, she mopped the hallway floors of an apartment building. In the evening, if she still had strength, she packaged takeout orders for a Mexican restaurant. Her schedule was scribbled in pencil on the back of Mia's homework notebook. The rented room for the mother and daughter was less than 10 square meters, a small bunk bed, a folding table, a bookcase made of composite wood, and a single electric stove. Lena tried to keep the study corner the brightest, where a green aloe plant sat, the only thing in the room that held the color of hope. When you're done eating, remember to reread those 2 pages, she instructed. Mia nodded. I read up to the word sincere. Mom, did I read it right? That's right. Sincere means saying what is true, even if it might be hard. When Lena walked out of the apartment complex, Ethan parked his car at the curb, lowering the window a fraction. He didn't dare approach. He just wanted to see how she lived after he pushed her out of his life. And the first thing he saw was, she still walked straight, her back unbent. The whole day passed slowly. Lena wiped tables, changed garbage bags, dumped dirty water, and wrung out her gloves. When someone asked, where did you work before? She simply replied, a restaurant downtown. She didn't mention the words, lost job. The phrase caught in her throat, but she didn't let it define her. By the afternoon, she bought a loaf of bread, some eggs, and scallions. It started to drizzle rain. On the corner, the black car remained parked. Ethan rested his hands on the steering wheel. He wanted to get out. He wanted to call her name, but something held him back. He was afraid, not afraid of rejection, but afraid that if he spoke now, the meeting would only be an excuse for his guilt. He used to think an apology was enough, but now he understood that an apology without change is just a way to soothe oneself. Night fell. In the room lit by the desk lamp, Lena prepared a quick and simple dinner. Mia talked about school, then hesitated and asked, people made the mistake. Why were you fired? Lena paused, pulling her daughter close. Because I didn't lie. Honey, when you tell the truth, sometimes you pay a price, but at least you don't owe anyone anything. She spoke slowly, each word as firm as a needle stitching cloth. Down on the street, Ethan still sat in his car, listening to the rain beat on the roof. The smell of toasted bread and fried scallions wafted faintly. The child's voice drifted down in broken sentences, blending with the memories in his mind. A dinner table for 4, his late daughter's laughter, and endless arguments. He realized for all those years, he used work as a shield against the fear of loss. And when that shield became too thick, everyone who loved him left. Upstairs, Mia asked again, "Mom, what does steadfast mean?" "It means holding on to what is right, even if no one stands beside you." "Like you that day?" Lena nodded. "Yes, but being strong isn't about yelling louder. Being strong is knowing what you won't do." Ethan looked at his watch. He had been sitting here too long. Finally, he opened the car door, stepped out into the rain, walked a few steps, and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The damp smell of old carpet rose. The metal railing was cold. Every reason against the meeting flooded his mind. She would think he pitied her. She wouldn't believe him. But if he turned back, everything he had discovered, the evidence of fraud, her honest gaze would fall into silence. Silence was what had kept him wrong for too long. He stood there, silent for a few seconds, then pulled his hand away from the railing. Not out of cowardice, but because he knew meeting her now would only relieve his conscience, not help her. He needed to genuinely change before he opened his mouth to apologize. Ethan returned to his car. In the dark cabin, he leaned his head back, taking a deep breath. He thought about what needed to be done. Gather enough evidence. Lock Victor's access. Present to the board. Invite an independent audit. And when everything was clear, he would return here, not as a CEO, but as a man coming to say the only sentence needed: "I was wrong." Upstairs, Lena pulled the blanket over Mia, turned off the desk lamp. She stood by the window, watching the rain fall in thin strands. Down on the street, the black car turned the corner, disappearing behind the trees. She didn't know who was in the car, nor did she need to. Tomorrow, she still had to work, still had to teach her daughter not to bow down to what was wrong. As for Ethan, when the car passed the last yellow light strip, he saw a raindrop roll slowly down the steering wheel, reflecting the light like an eye looking back at him. He held that gaze for a long time, because in that moment, he understood that eye was the part of his conscience he thought he had lost. The headlights of the black Mercedes S-Class cut across the dark alley. Ethan had left after hearing Lena affirm to Mia that she was fired for not lying. That statement, simple yet powerful, struck his conscience directly. He realized that arrogance didn't just ruin him, it forced an honest mother onto a difficult path. Ethan could no longer retreat behind his protective glass wall. He had to act. The next morning, Lena received a thick envelope delivered to her rented room. Inside was a blank white card and an unsigned invitation, asking her to come to the ward group CEO's office that afternoon to finalize the last procedures. Lena arrived at ward group with a defensive mindset. She thought Ethan had decided to offer a large settlement for her silence, or worse, sue her to protect the corporation's honor. She wore her worn coat, a complete contrast to the luxurious atmosphere surrounding her. When the CEO's office door opened, Ethan Ward was standing there. He no longer had the cold, arrogant expression he wore the night he humiliated her. Instead, he looked tense and somewhat uneasy. "Thank you for coming, Lena," he said, his voice dry, pointing directly at the chair opposite him. Lena sat down, keeping her back straight. "What does Mr. Ward wish to resolve?" Ethan did not offer settlement papers or court documents. Instead, he pushed a thick, red-marked financial folder in front of her. The folder clearly detailed suspicious transactions and the loopholes Victor had exploited to embezzle funds. Lena silently looked at the stack of papers. This was not a termination procedure. Ethan looked at Lena, his gaze no longer the contempt of a boss, but a difficult plea. He admitted the truth, bluntly. "I need your honesty, Lena. I need it to save myself and this corporation. Victor is exploiting the loophole that I created when I blindly trusted him and fired you." Lena looked up. She didn't react immediately. Her emotion was a struggle between logic and personal injury. Why should she save the man who had humiliated her? She remained silent, waiting for a more deserving confession. "I need an answer." "Lena," Ethan urged. Lena gently placed her hand on the folder, her voice calm. "Why should I do that?" "Mr. Ward, you humiliated me in front of a crowd. You took away my job because I told the truth. Why should I risk my life to save the empire of the man who ruined me?" Ethan took a deep breath, admitting his failure publicly and completely, shedding his last bit of arrogance. "I was wrong. I let arrogance cloud my judgment. I didn't just fire you. I publicly stripped you of your dignity simply because I couldn't accept that I had made a mistake. I repeated the mistake that cost me my family." He looked straight at her, his eyes unwavering. "Now I want to make amends. I need your help to expose Victor, not as an employee, but as the only partner I trust." Between them, for the first time, there was a strange moment of silence. There was no longer contempt, but an understanding of mistakes and a respect for each other's honesty. Lena realized this was the real Ethan Ward, a man facing the abyss, created by his own ego. This confession was not empty words, but the most painful humbling of a CEO. Lena looked at the file, and then into Ethan's eyes. She wouldn't do this for him, but for justice. She nodded. "I will help you, Mr. Ward, but I am doing this for the truth, not for you or the Ward Group." Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief, as if a weight had been partially lifted. "Exactly, Lena, for the truth." The next morning, Lena received a thin envelope at the reception desk. Inside was a temporary grey badge, clearly marked, "Lena Dawson, Vendor Audit," along with a brief authorization signed in blue ink by Ethan Ward. No praise, no message, just the necessary permissions to work. She put on the badge and walked into the hallway behind the kitchen. The smell of morning coffee mixed with floor cleaner. A few staff members glanced at her and then looked down, avoiding her eyes. The rumor of her return must have spread, but Lena didn't care. She didn't need anyone to take her side. She only needed the data to speak for itself. She started at the comps and voids counter. Quick notes. Habitual cancellation of items before shift closeout. 2 subsidiary accounts cancelling in pairs, and the cancellation amounts always just under the threshold for explanation. She underlined one word: habit. Fraud wasn't random. It was a habit that went unchecked. Upstairs, Ethan opened the surveillance screen. One corner for the audit meeting. One corner zoomed in on the manager area. In that frame, Lena was a small dot moving calmly among the files. No excess, no deficiency. Her every action was clear and neat. He realized that some people don't need justification. They just need to do what's right. At noon, Victor Lang appeared, his hands in his pockets, wearing the polite smile of someone accustomed to winning. "We don't need you here anymore," he said. Lena didn't look up. "I am working under authorization. Haven't you learned yet that asking too many questions isn't good?" He casually lifted the paper in her hand, his voice indifferent. Lena looked straight at him, her voice low and clear. "I left because I didn't lie, and I came back for the same reason." Victor paused, his smile fading slightly. Ethan, in the monitoring room, also stopped writing. The sentence didn't need to be loud, but it resonated deeply. In the afternoon, Lena went down to the document storage room. The room was narrow, illuminated by the cold light of fluorescent tubes. She pulled on her gloves, opened each folder, cross-referenced, and photographed the duplicate invoices. A young employee whispered a warning. "Be careful. Victor comes down here often." Lena only smiled lightly. "I'm just looking at paper." In a blind spot of the camera, she found a duplicate invoice, same number, same signature. Only the date was different. The pen strokes were shaky and repeated. As if copied, she bent down, tilting the paper under the light. A small detail, but the piece she needed. The storage room door burst open. Victor walked in, his voice calm, but his eyes scrutinizing. "I told you this area is not for vendors." "What are you doing?" Lena remained composed. "I am working under granted authority." He moved closer. "Authority is valid, until I say it's not." As he turned, his elbow bumped the electric kettle placed next to the file table. The kettle wobbled, and a few drops of hot water splashed out. Landing on Lena's hand, the water left a stinging pink mark on her skin. She suppressed a small gasp, placed the kettle securely back to keep it from spilling onto the documents. Victor feigned concern. "Me apologies. Are you okay? If you cause trouble, you have to expect to get wet." He shrugged and then left the storage room. Lena looked at the red mark on her hand. It wasn't deep, but it hurt. She rolled up her sleeve, tucked her notebook under her arm, and walked straight to the washroom. The cold water running over it soothed the burn, and her breathing returned to normal. No one else was there, and she didn't expect anyone. The door opened softly. Ethan walked in, holding a first aid kit. Lena was slightly surprised, but hid it. "I can handle it. It's a small mark. Let me," he said, his voice deep and slow. He opened the kit, washed his hands, dried them, and took out a bandage. "Keep the water running for another minute," he said. Looking at his watch, she complied, without arguing. When he bent down to turn off the faucet, placed a clean towel on the sink, gently dabbed the wound, and applied a thin layer of cream, his movements were light, as if afraid of hurting her. She realized, hands that had once caused injury now knew how to touch without pain. Ethan applied the bandage, tight enough to hold, loose enough for circulation. "Done." He took half a step back, as if restoring the distance. "Apologize," he said, still looking at the bandage. "Something like this should never be allowed to happen. Not even once." Lena pulled her sleeve down, her voice steady. "I'm used to it." "Mr. Ward," Ethan replied slowly, his voice dropping significantly. "Yes, and that is my fault, because I let you get used to enduring alone." He placed the dry towel on the sink, his voice lower. "Sometimes, letting others help isn't weakness. It's just time to stop bearing the weight." She was silent, then nodded slightly. "Thank you. I need to get back to work." He handed her a new pair of cloth gloves. "Wear these underneath. It will sting less. And if Victor comes near you again, call me directly. You're still watching the cameras?" "Yes, until I'm sure you're safe. After that, the cameras will only record justice." She gave a slight smile, not arguing. As she walked out, Ethan watched her, then picked up the phone. "Security. Remove all kettles from the storage room. Write up a new regulation and post it immediately." Late in the afternoon, they sat together in a small room near the server. On the table were files, a couple of tea mugs, and soft light. Lena presented the suspicious points, and Ethan listened, took notes, and asked brief questions. The atmosphere between them was no longer the distance of superior and employee, but the silent cooperation between two people who had once clashed. At one point, neither spoke. In the room, lit only by the screen, they sat still. No one discussed data. They were learning how to trust each other again through silence. The moment everything was clear, Ethan immediately signed the internal investigation requests. Before leaving, Lena paused at the door, raising her bandaged hand. "I don't need to be protected by promises. Mr. Ward, I just need this system to stop treating honest people like obstacles." Ethan replied softly, "I understand, and I need to learn how to make amends before anyone else gets hurt." A very slight smile crossed her lips. Not forgiveness, just a sign that trust could begin anew. When Lena stepped out, the evening air was cool and clear. Ethan looked through the glass. Seeing her figure disappear into the street, she was no longer a humiliated employee, but the person who was silently pulling an entire system toward what was right with quiet strength. In his heart, the thought echoed, this time not bitter but warm. One time was enough to learn. The rest is change. The door to the server room closed with a dry click. Ethan placed the small USB drive on the steel table. Start, he said. Lena nodded, plugging a second USB drive into the backup port. On the screen, the data flowed like two river branches, one real stream leading to the security system, and a bait stream heading toward the shortcut Victor usually used after midnight. Are you sure? She asked. I am. When he opens the file, my phone will alert me. The plan was simple. Victor would walk into the trap, driven by greed. Everything looked just real enough for him not to suspect. As for them, they just had to wait. Lena opened 4 camera feeds: the manager's office, the cashier's counter, the document storage room, and the back door. The screen light illuminated their 2 silent faces. Outside, the building slept in darkness. Around 11 p.m., Victor appeared in the frame. He walked straight to the filing cabinet, opened it, took an envelope, and texted someone. Without zooming in, they both understood he was signaling the person behind him. 10 minutes later, a man wearing a cap entered. No greeting. No seating. He took the envelope and left. Ethan leaned forward, whispering, "We've got him." Lena still watched the screen. Wait longer. A greedy person never takes just once, just as she said. Shortly after, Victor returned, turned on his computer, and quickly performed an operation. Ethan's phone vibrated softly. He exhaled. He touched it. Lena, till the hill. Checking the screen again. She wasn't elated. Evidence is only valuable when we are patient enough, she said. The night dragged on, with only the sound of the fan and their breathing. Ethan poured water, placing a cup beside her. Sugar? He asked. No, she replied. Just warm water. They sat in the dim light, waiting for the system to save the data. Time passed slowly, and in those quiet moments, matters unrelated to computers gradually surfaced. Is the little girl okay? Ethan asked softly. He didn't say her name, but Lena knew he was referring to Mia. She's fine, she said. She's learning the word steadfast. Ethan smiled lightly. A difficult word, even for adults. Lena looked at the screen, then asked in return, "Did you ever have that kind of time with your daughter?" The question silenced him. When he answered, his voice was small. "I thought time was something I could make up for later. That after this project, after that deal, I would spend more time at home. But children don't wait. One day, I lost my daughter, and later meant nothing." Lena was silent. She only turned her water cup. Listening, he continued, "I thought I could buy forgiveness with gifts, with vacations. But my wife didn't need those things. She just needed me to be present. I never learned." The air in the room thickened. The screen reflected 2 faces, one remembering, one maintaining calm, so as not to interrupt. Lena spoke quietly, but every word was clear. Forgiveness doesn't come from words. It only comes when people truly change. When the actions start to differ, Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You are saying," he said slowly, "I can't ask for forgiveness. I can only live as someone worthy of being forgiven." "That's right," she replied, "and the person worthy might still not be forgiven, but they no longer owe the truth." Silence enveloped the room. In the blue light, the 2 people sat still. No one discussed data. They were learning how to trust each other again through silence. A small chime sounded. The system displayed confirmation of unauthorized access. Ethan nodded. "It's done." He sent the report to the audit department, his voice calm. "Lock the copies. Preserve the chain of evidence." Do not inform Victor yet. Why? Lena asked. Because if he thinks he's safe, he'll try to pull the person behind him into the light himself. She nodded, her eyes not leaving the screen. They think they're leading us into a trap, but in fact, they are the ones being recorded. Night turned late. The projector light dimmed. Ethan took off his jacket, folded it, and placed it on the back of her chair. She just nodded, not saying thank you, but they both understood the gesture. He called her name for the first time, without adding Ms. or Mr. Lena. She turned around. I admire you, he said, making no effort to soften the words. Initially out of guilt, now out of respect, Lena replied. Respect doesn't need words. Mr. Ward. Just the right actions. On the screen, Victor was seen gathering documents, heading toward the door. Ethan typed the final command, saving all the evidence. They looked at each other, as if they had just climbed a long hill. No smiles, but quiet understanding. Ethan stood up, reaching out his hand. Let's finish this. Lena shook his hand, brief but firm. When they turned off the lights in the monitoring room, the hallway was lit only by the faint blue light from the exit signs. Their footsteps echoed evenly, dryly, like a heartbeat that had regained its calm. No one spoke about the future. They only carried two things: evidence that was sufficient and a new definition of forgiveness. Not words of dismissal, but the courage to keep moving in the right direction, one day at a time. The elevator door opened with a short ding. Ethan and Lena stepped out into the glass-walled corridor leading to the press conference room. In Ethan's hand were two tamper-proof sealed bags, the USB drives they had just handed over to the legal team. The path was only a few hundred meters, but he felt like he was walking through two halves of a life. One half was silence. The other was truth. Just outside the lobby, the head of the legal team nodded. The chain of custody has been signed. The investigative agency is awaiting the announcement, after which we will transfer the originals. Ethan placed one bag on the table, pushing it toward them. He kept the other, as a reminder to himself not to let go of responsibility. Inside the auditorium, camera lights were already on. Rows of reporters were packed tightly. The array of microphones bearing the logos of various TV networks pointed toward the podium. When they saw Ethan enter, a murmur spread. But when they recognized Lena walking beside him, the sound changed whispers of surprise. It's her. Ethan paused for half a second at the edge of the red carpet. He turned to her. Are you ready? We are only doing what is right. We don't need to be ready for noise. Lena replied, her voice even. They both walked onto the podium. The lights shone directly, the atmosphere tense. But this time, the person standing straight, head held high, was Lena. On the small name card placed in front of her, Lena Dawson, Internal Control Advisor. Ethan began briefly. Today, Ward Group announces the results of an internal investigation and evidence regarding a chain of fraud that has taken place within the restaurant system. The screen behind them lit up. A diagram of the money trail appeared, the map Lena had built over many nights. Arrows connected unusual cancelled items to transfers made to fictitious supplier accounts. No jargon was needed. The visual explanation was sufficient. Lena stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. This is the chain of after-hours access by management, where permissions were improperly elevated to modify data. This is the pair of invoices with matching numbers, different dates, and the same signature, and this time-stamped footage, showing the transfer of documents outside the control area. On the screen, a fast-forwarded video showed Victor accessing his computer late at night. The lens captured his every familiar movement. The crowd murmured, then gradually fell silent. No commentary was needed. The images spoke for themselves. A side door opened. Victor Lang walked in, his familiar, confident posture intact. But when the next slide appeared, the scene of him handing the envelope to the man in the baseball cap, his smile vanished. A reporter shouted, Mr. Lang, do you have any comment? Victor swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm being framed. That clip is edited. Lena didn't look at him, simply stating, the original clip has been sealed and time stamped. Your access account is the only point with the authority to create this chain of entries. The sentence dropped like a slow dagger. Below, some staff members wiped away tears without knowing why. Perhaps because for the first time they saw a person exposed, and a person who had once been silent now stood up to defend the truth. Immediately after, 2 plainclothes officers walked in, speaking quickly with the legal team. Soaks, F.O. Quat. One read the arrest warrant. Victor's face turned ashen. He turned away, looking for something to cling to. There was no kettle left to kick over, no camera left to obscure. He was escorted out of the auditorium in absolute silence. The representative of the Hartley Group, the former partner, jumped up, trying to justify himself. We were not involved. But the sentence was cut short when the second officer presented a warrant to investigate co-conspirators in the fraud. Flashbulbs exploded continuously. The air was thick. An old era was collapsing. Ethan took a deep breath. Stepping up to the podium, he held no notes. And he didn't look toward the door. He looked straight at the crowd. Ward Group was exploited by a person we once trusted, he said, his voice deep. But if I stop there, I still haven't told the whole truth. Because this chain of misconduct only existed because the person at the top, to me, chose to believe in silence, rather than in data and people. He paused, meeting Lena's eyes on the side row. The truth was saved by a person I once wronged. Her integrity preserved our honor. His voice softened, then dropped low. I apologize. Lena, not to be forgiven, but to be able to start over. The silence was so deep that the faint whirring of the video camera could be heard. Below, many employees bowed their heads. Some wiped away tears. Some just watched him, saying nothing, as if checking if the words were genuine. And for the first time, they saw an owner truly bow his head. Ethan continued, his voice firmer. I hereby announce Lena Dawson as Ward Group's strategic partner in building the new internal control system. She has full authority to say no to anything she deems wrong. Even to me. The entire auditorium held its breath. Lena did not stand up, nor did she make a dramatic gesture. She only nodded very slightly, exactly the way one nods when a final calculation has balanced out. A reporter asked, Miss Lena, do you agree with how Mr. Ward describes your role? Yes, Lena replied. But let me add, the new system is not to protect reputation, but to protect honest people so they don't have to leave again. Applause erupted. Not overwhelming, but deep. The sound of respect, something rarer than admiration. Lenses zoomed in. In the frame, Ethan looked toward Lena. His gaze was no longer arrogant, nor pleading. Only pure respect remained. A man who once thought power lay in having the final word now understood that true strength lay in daring to say the first word, I was wrong. They left the podium amidst the urgent calls of the press. Behind them, the legal team took over. The investigative agency received the files, and PR updated the press release. The chaotic room was being reorganized by steps planned throughout the night. Ethan paused at the door, gesturing for Lena to step first. She walked slowly, her posture still straight, her eyes looking forward. Not the posture of someone whose honor has been restored, but someone who had never lost it. Outside, the first seasonal rain was falling lightly. Ethan said softly, We still have work tonight with the audit team. Yes? Lena replied, and tomorrow morning with the operations team. The truth won't stand firm unless the tracks are repaired. He gave a faint smile. From that moment on, no more traps needed to be set. The rest was rebuilding with trust. And amidst the dispersing crowd, someone whispered, For the first time, Ward Group is not just strong because of money, but because it learned how to stand with the person who told the truth. The back door of the auditorium closed with a dry click. The legal team handed Lena the final envelope. Original reconciliation minutes. The Economic Court received the file at 7 p.m. She nodded, holding the documents close to her chest, and turned toward the service elevator, leading down to the B2 parking garage. Ethan called after her, "I'll be down later. Quick meeting with the auditor. Then I'll come." She raised her hand to signal she heard him. The elevator fell into metallic silence. The door opened, and a cold gust of air from the parking garage wafted out. White fluorescent lights stretched across the ceiling. B2 was slightly darker because 2 bulbs were flickering. Lena walked slowly, checking twice out of habit, keys in her right hand, phone in her pocket, the envelope held tight against her. Her footsteps echoed evenly, blending with the sound of the ventilation fan. In the opposite blind spot, a figure extinguished a cigarette, flicking it into a puddle on the floor. He retreated behind a concrete pillar, his eyes following her. Her phone vibrated. A text message from the court. Received. Timestamp 7:17 p.m. Lena exhaled. Just then, a call came in, displaying Mia's name. The little girl spoke quickly. Her breath rushed. "Mommy, you forgot your shawl. I'm with Miss Brote. Julie, in the ground floor lobby. It's cold. Are you going to be long?" Lena chuckled softly. "I'll be right up. Don't come down to the garage. Stay next to Ms. Julie. Okay?" She hung up and put the phone away. She turned the key. A heavy set of footsteps sounded behind her. Lena didn't turn around immediately. She pressed the car lock, which beeped. The footsteps changed rhythm. Coming closer, she tucked the envelope tighter against her arm and turned around. "Ms. Dawson?" The voice was deep and husky, like someone who hadn't slept. "I need to see a document quickly." He gave a dry laugh. "It's just paper." Lena didn't answer, stepping back half a pace but keeping her eyes level. He took another step, raising his hand as if to brush her arm aside. At the same moment, the phone in her pocket vibrated violently again. Not a call. It was the SOS signal from the access card Ethan had installed. If the GPS in B2 and the accelerometer detected impact, the system would send an alert to security. And to him, in the ground floor lobby, Mia looked at the clock, clutching her shawl tighter. She stood on her tiptoes, peering over the railing toward the parking garage. Her small phone vibrated. Ethan had told her, "If anything makes you feel uneasy, just call me." She pressed the call button, speaking quickly. "Uncle Ethan, Mom said she'd be right up, but the B2 light is flickering. I'm worried." Ethan was standing next to the legal room. His other phone vibrated. SOS B2, abnormal movement. He didn't need to hear the rest. "Stay put with Miss Julie." "Mia," he said, running toward the service elevator. In B2, the man shoved Lena's shoulder hard. She staggered, her back hitting the car door, her arm clutching the envelope tightly. "It's just paper," he repeated, his voice starting to snap. "Hand it over and save us the trouble." He reached out. Lena dodged, her left hand slightly opening the car door, her right hand pressing the key fob into her palm like a hard point. "Step back," she said, her voice low but clear. He sneered, pressing closer. His rough hand pushed against her shoulder. Lena lost her balance slightly. Across the row of pillars, the elevator dinged sharply. The door opened. Ethan stepped out without hesitation, his eyes scanning the area. He immediately saw Lena pinned between the pillar and the car, the envelope clutched tightly to her chest. He rushed forward. "Hey!" The attacker spun around, unable to react before Ethan blocked the way, one arm pulling Lena behind his back, the other instinctively raised to create distance. His voice boomed. reverberating in the concrete space. "Don't touch her." The sound came out clean and firm. Not a shout. It repeated the line that started this story. But now, from a different position, the speaker was the man who had been wrong. Now standing straight, shielding the person in front of him. The man paused for half a second, his eyes darting around. From the end of the aisle, 2 security guards rushed over. They had received the SOS and the location. The man retreated, intending to run for the emergency exit. One guard blocked him with a baton. The other moved to intercept. He abandoned the idea of arguing, turned, and bolted through the old exit route. The walkie-talkie buzzed, tracking the subject. Heading B1. Dordri. Ethan still stood blocking, his back tense, his breathing returning to normal. "Are you okay?" he asked, turning his head quickly. Lena nodded, still clutching the envelope. Just then, tiny footsteps echoed at the end of the ramp. Mommy, Mia, worried, had pulled Miss Docting, Julie's hand and run down to the edge of the garage. Seeing the security guards, the little girl paused instinctively, then dashed forward. Ethan managed to bend down. Mia hugged him tightly, bursting into tears. "You saved Mommy. I knew you weren't bad." The sentence came out exactly like a verdict that had been overturned. Ethan laughed a small laugh, not hiding the tear that fell from the corner of his eye. This time the tear didn't taste of shame. It was light, like an opening door. He placed his hand on Mia's head, looking over her shoulder at Lena. She nodded, her eyes worried yet warm, as if saying, "Now that you're here, stay, don't turn away again." The security team returned to report. Subject ran out the ramp. Cameras caught the license plate. "We are coordinating with the police." Ethan nodded, instructing further, "Increase lighting in B2 immediately tonight, and station personnel to guide people until this is over." He didn't use the words absolute safety. He only said what he could do right now. Lena opened her palm. A patch of red irritation had formed on her wrist from scraping against the car door edge. Ethan saw it. Not asking if it hurt, he pulled a bandage from his pocket, a habit formed after the incident in the storage room, applying it quickly. His movements familiar. "Get checked out at the hospital just in case," he said. "No need for admission, but a doctor should look at it." They went to the nearest emergency room. Lena had only minor scrapes. Stable pulse. No. Impact. Mia sat next to her, holding the neatly folded shawl on her lap, her eyes still teary but trying to appear calm. When the nurse left, the room quieted down. Ethan sat on the edge of a metal chair, his hands clasped, finding himself, for the first time in years, with a reason to sit still. Not rushing to a meeting, he spoke softly, not looking at anyone but Lena. "If I hadn't humiliated you that day, perhaps I would never have met myself again." The sentence didn't demand forgiveness. It merely set a benchmark. Lena looked up. "If you hadn't stopped that day when you heard my daughter yell," she replied calmly, "I wouldn't have believed there was still something good left in you." She paused. "And if you hadn't arrived in time tonight, I probably wouldn't have believed it anymore." Ethan smiled wearily, nodding, accepting the fragility of that trust as something obvious to respect. Mia leaned over, tucking the shawl into Lena's hand. "Don't forget it again." "Mom, I'm afraid of the cold." Lena stroked her daughter's head, holding the little girl closer. In the hallway, a cart rolled back and forth. Ethan's phone vibrated a text from security. Subject apprehended at B1 gate. Police taking custody. He replied with the word, "Thanks." Then he put his phone away, as if closing an old chapter. The doctor returned, giving simple instructions. Keep warm. Apply cream. Monitor for dizziness. They left as the city lights came on. Outside the hospital, the wind carried the scent of rain and wet trees. Ethan stood beside the mother and daughter, not intruding on their embrace. just raising his hand to call a car. When the car door opened, Lena paused for a second, turning to him. "Tomorrow, we have the meeting with the operations team. Don't be late." "I won't be late," he replied. "And, if you allow me, I will drive you both home every evening until this is over." Lena looked at him, as if weighing the offer. "Agreed," she said, "but not because of fear, because I want Mia to know when adults say they will protect, they actually do it." The car door closed softly. Ethan stood watching the car merge into the stream of lights. On the reflective glass screen, he saw a version of himself, no longer the man who only gave orders in brightly lit, cold rooms. He had just uttered the sentence he needed to learn by heart: "Don't touch her." And that sentence, tonight, didn't just save one person, it saved him from his former self. As the car door closed, Ethan raised his hand to salute the driver, then stepped back to watch until the taillights disappeared at the intersection. He turned his back to the hospital, pulling out his phone to send a short message to the security team. "Escort Route B, 2 main lobby for 2 weeks. Prioritize mother and child." After sending the message, he sighed. A light rain had just stopped, water droplets sparkling on the street like small periods, concluding the stressful chain of nights. 6 months later, the ward group building opened its doors in the morning with a distinctly different rhythm. The meeting rooms no longer hosted endless arguments. The indicator charts rose steadily like a stable heart rate. The flagship kitchen displayed new procedure boards. All voids divided by exemptions required a verification code. Cameras were moved to better angles, and biometric clock-in was required for every shift. In the lobby, a modest poster introduced the Mia Foundation, a fund supporting scholarships and skills classes for the children of service industry workers. Named after the little girl who once spoke the sentence the entire company did not want to forget. At a brief press conference, Ethan stepped onto the podium, making no compromises with honesty. "Today, Ward Group announces the Mia Foundation program and the appointment of Lena Dawson as head of finance and internal control." He paused for the applause to pass. "This position reflects our absolute trust in her ethics and capability." At the back of the room, a few chefs clapped louder than necessary. In the second row, a young waiter murmured, "She really came back." The statement was light as a breeze, but enough to remind everyone. Sometimes, respect begins by calling a value by its rightful name. In the afternoon, on a gently sloping street corner, the L.M. Café sign glowed, a warm cream color. The small cafe was a Ward Group project supporting employee startups, an idea from Lena and the operations team, a place to balance life, where employees could understand the flow of business from the cup to the ledger. By the window was a small basket of chrysanthemums, and a wooden frame held a few charcoal sketches. Mia sat by the window, focused on coloring a picture, 3 people holding hands, with a sky above them dotted with small raindrops. She added a purple shawl around the neck of the person in the middle, then tilted her head to admire it, satisfied with the detail. Lena checked the espresso machine, reminding the new barista, "Water, 90 to 94 degrees. Don't rush, take the right time, and customers will thank you by returning." Her voice was calm as a flowing stream. On the shelf behind the counter was a small donation box with the inscription, "A gifted coffee for those who continue to work even on rainy days." It was a weekly offering from the cafe. The bell above the door jingled. Ethan walked in, sleeves rolled up. "No secretary, no assistant." He paused for a moment at the threshold, as if asking permission to join a rhythm that wasn't that of a boardroom. Mia looked up first, smiling broadly. "Uncle," she put down her pencil, ran over, stopping a foot away, close enough for warmth, far enough to be polite. As her mother taught, then held out her crayon box. "I drew Mom's cafe. That's beautiful," Ethan said, sitting in the chair opposite the window. The afternoon light poured across the wooden table, spreading like butter. He looked at Lena, at the counter. She was instructing the barista to gently tap the portafilter to tamp the coffee grounds evenly, then turned back to Mia. "What are you drawing in the sky?" "Rain, but just small rain. After the rain, it gets bright," Mia said, very confidently. Lena brought out 2 cups, a hot black coffee for Ethan, a cocoa for Mia, and a cup of warm water for herself. She sat down next to her daughter, her eyes making an unconscious round of checks. The corner table guests were comfortable, the machine was stable, the lights were bright enough. Then she looked at Ethan. There was no longer caution, but also no casual familiarity. Between them was a comfortable distance, the distance of people who had weathered a great storm and didn't need to talk much about it. "Is the company stable?" she asked. "Stable," Ethan replied. The foundation also received 2 additional grants. The first class starts next week, teaching personal financial management for part-time employees. He smiled lightly. The curriculum was approved by the head of finance and internal control. Lena raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like too grand a title for a 12-page document." "Page 13 is the most important page," Ethan said. "A blank page for students to write their own commitments." Mia sipped her cocoa, carefully placing the cup down so as not to spill, and continued coloring the shawl. "Mommy, can we have noodles at home tonight?" "Yes." Lena stroked her daughter's head. "But you have to wash your own bowl." "I know." Mia nodded firmly, then tilted her head. "Uncle Ethan, are you eating with us?" Ethan looked at Lena as if asking permission. She nodded. "If you promise not to yell at the server," she said, her voice slow and witty. Ethan laughed, raising both hands. "I promise." He turned to Mia. "I used to be a very bad grown-up in restaurants. Now I'm learning again from the beginning." The moment was quiet enough to hear the aroma of coffee spreading. Outside the door, pedestrians slowed down to peer in, seeing a normal scene. A man, a woman, and a child, sharing an afternoon. Ethan looked at Mia, then at Lena. His voice deepened slightly, as if trying to place the words correctly. "You taught me something that money can't buy. That is how to put conscience above profit, and how to respect people over arrogance." He didn't say it to flatter, he said it as a brief summation of the past 6 months, for the meetings where he learned to step back from the microphone, for the times he called instead of commanded, and for every evening he parked down the street to watch the mother and daughter go home safely. "Thank you," Lena replied, simply. "But you learned many things yourself. You provided the map," he said. "I was just the one learning to read it again." He paused, placing his cup down. "Lena, if I asked you out to dinner, not as boss and employee, but as 2 regular people, would you say yes?" The question was without background music, without embellishment. It stood there, simple, hoping for an answer, just as simple. Lena glanced at Mia. The little girl pretended not to hear, but the corner of her mouth curved up. Lena turned back, her eyes bright with a playful glint. "If you promise not to yell at the server," Ethan touched his chest. "I promise." "Then, not tonight, tomorrow night," Lena said. "After she finishes her homework," Mia interjected. "And you have to say thank you when the server pours water." "I'll say it twice," Ethan replied. They stood up. Mia ran to grab a hand from each of them. The 3 walked toward the door. At the threshold, a young employee opened the door for a customer, looking slightly flustered upon seeing Ethan. He smiled, bowing his head slightly. "Thank you for welcoming us." The employee blushed, replying profusely, "Yes, thank you, sir. You." The bell jingled closed behind them. The yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk, casting a warm layer onto their shoulders. The rain had stopped. The street was still wet. Reflecting the streetlights like horizontal streaks of stars, they walked slowly, not because they were afraid of slipping, but because there was no need to rush anymore. On the street corner, the tiny Mia Foundation sign was posted on the community board, next to a flyer for math tutoring and a lost cat notice. Ethan glanced at it, then looked down at the small hand holding his. Mia looked up. "Do you remember what I said?" "I remember." Ethan nodded. "What was it?" "Don't touch her." Mia smiled, holding his hand tighter. "Now you don't need to say it anymore, because no one dares." Lena laughed, shaking her head. "It's not because they dare or don't dare. It's because they know there is someone here who speaks the truth and someone who will do the right thing." Ethan fell silent because no more words were needed. The wind blew through. Cool, but not cold. He thought about the things he had lost and the things he had just regained. Not stock value or reputation, but the feeling of standing on someone else's side besides his own, the feeling of being a protector. They turned onto the small street leading home. High above, a band of clouds separated, revealing a thin, paper-like blue sky. Mia skipped a step, holding up her drawing. "I'm going to color in the sunshine. Remember to leave a few raindrops." Lena said, "So, we know the sunshine is precious." "Yes?" Mia replied, very seriously. The three shadows stretched long on the damp street, then shortened as they passed under an awning. Behind them, the L&M Cafe continued to glow warmly, the scent of coffee still lingering. Ahead, a simple evening awaited them: noodles, spelling homework, and the Foundation's weekend picnic plans. Some stories conclude with loud explosions. This story concludes with a softly opened door, a small promise, and three hands clasped together on a wet sidewalk after the rain. Sometimes, an innocent sentence from a child saves two adults from the darkest parts of themselves. Some stories end not with applause, but with the silence of those who are thinking. Ward Group that night didn't just win by proving the truth. It won because it dared to do what is rare in the corporate world: bow down, admit error, and start anew. Ethan, the man who once believed that power meant never being wrong, understood that, sometimes, the greatest strength lies in two words: "I apologize." And Lena, the woman who was once seen as an obstacle, proved that honesty doesn't diminish us. It forces every system to grow to fit it. Their lesson is simple, yet profound. The truth can be delayed, but it never loses its way home. In a world where everyone fears being misunderstood, remember, sometimes, all it takes is one person who dares to speak the truth, dares to stand straight, dares to be steadfast in what is right, to change an entire collective. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation like Lena, where speaking the truth meant losing something? Or were you once like Ethan, realizing the truth too late, but still wanting to make things right? If so, tell me, because every honest story deserves to be heard. Thank you for staying until the end of today's video, because sometimes, just a small line can remind someone out there that justice doesn't start in the courtroom, but in the conscience,